how it was kind of a crooked thing. Had they just really, the bottom line point is, if they would have just written the amendment that says the newly freedmen have the right to vote, you would have never had any of this, but they didn't write it that way, which opened it up to shenanigans. Do you remember the other poll tax? It was the most, really the most awful one of all. You're shaking your head.
Like if you were to vote once and not do it like next year, you have to pay like for the, like if I were to do it this year and then not vote until 10 years later, I'd have to pay the money from in between those.
You remember what that was called?
No.
Anybody remember what that was called? If you didn't pay the poll tax for 3 or 4 years in a row, go ahead, Maria. Cumulative poll tax. Cumulative, easier for me to say, the cumulative poll tax was actually set up so that if you did not pay, you were going to have to, or did not vote, you were going to have to pay for every election that you didn't vote. So if $1 or $2 was a lot of money back then, and it was, imagine if you didn't vote for 5 years and you had to pay $5 or $10. Odds are you would probably never end up voting because you couldn't ever get caught up with the poll tax. Keep that one in mind. And then the last test was kind of a pretty easy one.
Grandfather test?
Grandfather. What was the grandfather clause?
Basically, if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote.
Yeah, if your grandfather could vote before slavery had been, made illegal, then you could vote. And this one, again, was really kind of interesting because, poor whites' grandfathers probably weren't going to have been able to vote because they were going to have been poor. Newly freedmen's grandfathers wouldn't have been able to vote because they wouldn't have been freed. They'd have been slaves, or maybe they wouldn't have even been in the country. So this was another way, not race, not color, not servitude, but in fact, it was based on the fact that your grandfather couldn't vote. And one thing that the video mentions in there, and take a look at this, there were some whites that they wanted to vote that couldn't read. They would actually use the grandfather clause to protect their right to vote because their grandfather could vote, well, we're going to let you vote, but they couldn't pass the other test. So while the grandfather clause usually banned people from voting in a twisted kind of ironic way, it actually did protect people's rights to vote, at least white folks, from time to time. Take a good look at that. What was the 13th Amendment? 13th, 14th, and 15th were those Civil War Reconstruction Amendments. 15th dealt with voting. What did the 13th do?
Ended slavery.
13th ended slavery or involuntary servitude. That's a pretty straightforward thing, and we didn't spend a lot of time on that because it's pretty straightforward. What did the 14th Amendment do? What's that?
Citizenship.
Citizenship. What do you mean?
For African American slaves.
Citizenship for African American slaves.
No, and slaves and everyone.
And slaves and everyone.
Yes.
Actually, we did talk about citizenship with the 14th Amendment. That is the amendment that in today's world, if somebody, and I think I may have dropped the term an anchor baby, if somebody is from another country and they come over and they have a child, the 14th Amendment says that that child is an American citizen. And the term anchor baby is kind of derisive, so I want to be careful with that. But the basic idea is that if you come over and you have a baby in the country, then you're now anchored to the country so that you're going to stay. That wasn't maybe the intention, but that's the result of what happened. But there were some things that they did intend to do with the 14th. Do you remember what it was? Remember how the 14th Amendment dealt with, go ahead.
Cracking down on states violating people's rights.
Zoom in on Pencola. Yeah, it actually did. Do you remember what they did to some of these states? Because you're absolutely right.
I don't.
Anybody remember what the 14th did to crack on the former? Go ahead.
It prevented people who were, if I remember correctly, I'm going to get part of this wrong, who had sworn an oath to the United States, but went with the South from holding office again.
Yeah, it did. If you had an office, and they ran through a long list of offices that if you had, and you took an oath to the United States, and then you went with the Confederacy, one of the sections of the 14th Amendment specifically said that these folks were not going to be allowed to automatically come back and get reelected and then resume their positions in office when the states rejoined the Union. And remember, the Confederate States, they were forced to ratify 13, 14, and 15 as part of the condition for readmittance into the Union. They had lost the war, so this was something that they had to do to kind of survive the peace. That's kind of an important piece. Do you remember how the 14th Amendment related to the Bill of Rights? Go ahead.
It basically made it so that the states had to follow them as well.
Yeah, in the beginning of the country, the Bill of Rights only applied to actions of the federal government. And when I had read you several of the sections, it dealt in there talking about states shall not deprive, or states are going to provide due process, these kinds of things. It said states for the first time. And basically, through the 14th Amendment, most of the first 10 amendments have been incorporated. So now, if a state violates your religion or your speech or your guns in some instances, or unreasonable searches and seizures going on down the line, the Bill of Rights can stop those actions through the 14th Amendment. So kind of keep that thought in mind. What else have you got? Go ahead, Naomi.
Emil wants to know about the Missouri Compromise.
What was the Missouri Compromise? Go ahead, Daniel.
It allowed Maine in Missouri to enter the Union, Maine being a free state and Missouri being a slave state.
That is true. There was something else to it, though, right? Why'd they call it the Missouri Compromise? Go ahead.
When Dred Scott left Missouri, I believe, and then went to another state that was free and came back to Missouri, he claimed that leaving the state made him free, so he sued the government. He went to certain court and sued, saying that he should be free and not a slave anymore, and then they ruled it out and said just because one state is free doesn't mean the other state.
You had more cookies today, didn't you?
I did.
Yeah, I can tell on this after the trip yesterday. Remember, and I'm going to add this page too, so you can take a look at the map. And forgive me, this thing isn't really cooperating all that well. But you notice up here that red line. The Missouri Compromise line set 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude is the magic line. And any state that was going to be admitted after the Missouri Compromise above 3630 was going to be free. Any state that was going to be admitted after 3630 south was now going to be a slave state. And the compromise was Missouri was added as a slave state even though it was above 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. I believe this was where I had asked each of the classes, okay, if you have a car, bless you. Okay, everybody's sneezing. I believe I had asked if you have a car in Maryland or Maine or Florida or California or Oregon. I mean, isn't your property wherever you go? And see, the thing of it was you said, yeah. Well, when we get into this idea of Dred Scott in just a second, you know, the compromise basically was saying was that if you took slaves into the North, they weren't going to be slaves anymore. But can you just take away somebody's property just because they're in a different part of the country? Well, no, and that's part of the reason why this failed. But I'll add this page so that you can take a look at this. But that key line was 36 degrees, 30 minutes north latitude. And I think I had even pointed out, it sure looked like there was more land north of 3630 than there was south. But they would always kind of add states, Daniel, to your point, in pairs. So that way, what would prevent slavery from ending as long as you added two states at the same time, one free and one slave?
The Senate would be balanced.
The Senate would always stay tied. The House could change a little bit depending upon population, but the slave state senators and the free state senators would always vote to their slave or free status as long as you kept the same number of states. The Senate would not allow that to be unvoted. So they were just kind of kicking the can down the road. What other questions have y'all got? And let me pull back up on this. Actually, so the 13th, the 14th, the 15th Amendment, and I might add a few more terms in here. So if I start going off on some tangents, I'll make sure I add those terms in because it's really a little light right now. But anything else that jumps out? Go ahead, Lily.
Plessy versus Ferguson. That's like the train one, right?
That's the train one. Who was Plessy?
The dude on the train.
What was his name?
Something Plessy.
Something Plessy. Yeah, thank you. Zoom in on him. Yeah, thank you, Marvin. What was Plessy's name? Homer Plessy. What happened in this case? What was unique or significant about Homer Plessy?
He was like white, but like he was like 1/8 black, right?
It was like white, but like 1/8 black, huh? Okay, remember this on camera. You got to be careful with this. If you remember, It wasn't his parents or his grandparents, but his great-grandparents. One was black and one was white. And he, by the time, he had always had other white grandparents or parents, as this lineage came down. He was a very, 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 very light-skinned black man. What did he do dealing with the trains?
He purposely got a white person's ticket.
According to the law, if you were 1/8 black, then in fact you were considered black. And the idea was they had these segregated train cars. So if you were white, you had to buy a ticket for the whites-only cars. If you were black, you had to buy a ticket on the black or coloreds-only cars. And he bought a white ticket. And by looking at him, it's very reasonable that you'd thunk that he was a white guy. How did they find out that he wasn't?
He told them.
He told them. Why would he tell them?
He wanted to go to court.
He wanted to get caught. He wanted to go to court. He wanted to challenge these segregated rail cars. So he did get to the Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson. And what ended up happening when he got there? What's that, Lily? Zoom in on her.
He got arrested.
He got arrested in court.
Oh, no, sorry, I missed that part.
Yeah, what happened when he went to court? Yeah, get closer to her, Mark. We got to get a good shot of this right now. Yeah, what happened when he went to court? Because he set this up. He wanted to challenge the laws. And I mentioned to you that sometimes it's easier if you only need to get 5 justices to say yes to you than hundreds of elected officials. Go ahead.
Did they vote against him?
They did. You remember why? Remember what the doctrine was that they established? Separate but equal was the doctrine. Separate but equal. The train cars had same number of seats, same windows, same restroom facilities. These cars were exactly the same. And Plessy versus Ferguson would basically establish race relations for the first half of the 20th century because the idea was that it was perfectly legal to separate or segregate the races as long as the materials, as long as the bathrooms, as long as the schools, as long as the whatever was equal. And what you saw, maybe for a while, was that separate was equal. But what you saw as the 21st century went along was separate was inherently unequal in a lot of places. So yeah, Homer Plessy lost, and actually this was something that set race relations, well not race relations, but race policy back for a good half century until we get to Brown versus Board of Education. I'll scroll down and move off the terms. Are there anything up here that you notice right off? Any other questions? Go ahead, Manny.
I was going to ask, what are you referring to with the quote-unquote knowing?
Knowing. Okay, if you remember what I had said on there, and we were talking about the schools being segregated, or life being segregated, with the Jim Crow laws. If you remember what we were talking about, I had mentioned to you, if you happen to know somebody in a group, it was easier to accept or to dispel some of the stereotypes or the fear. But the longer that you kept people segregated so that you really didn't know the people that you were separated from, then it was harder. And I think the example that I had given you that was maybe more modern was Will and Grace. And I had mentioned to you that Jack, the character on Will and Grace, was kind of what people knew in terms of somebody being gay in a more modern sense. And Jack did an awful lot to kind of help socialize people that it was okay. If you knew somebody that was gay, or in today's context, if you knew somebody that was undocumented, it was easier to accept these folks than if, in fact, you didn't know anybody, and you wouldn't have if you go back to the race and the segregation decades and decades ago. What other questions have y'all got?